visit a couple of friends. I had studied with in high school. They had moved to the city of Berkeley to study at the University of California, and since then every summer, I traveled there to visit the man, spend that time with him since we studied together all through high school and we're practically like brothers. This is a trip I usually take by plane, but last year I drove because there were several places along the way that I really wanted to visit, including parks, museums, and historical sites that I wanted to see. I left early that day to have time to visit these sites, as doing the whole trip would take me a few days, and I wanted to make the best use of the time. The first 2 days of the trip went pretty well and were completely normal, but on the third day I expected to have arrived at my destination, and instead I was still driving in the middle of the night. It was probably between 9-10 p.m. By this time, the road was very quiet and there wasn't much traffic, which was very pleasant to feel a little unsettling, as I've always been a little afraid of desolate roads. I still had a few hours to go, and I was really looking forward to getting to my friend's house as soon as possible, but I needed to get to the bathroom and have a coffee to wake up a bit. I stopped at the next exit where there was a rest upon the side of the road. This one was quite small, nothing to do with those big rest stops that have parking for trucks and a gas station next to them. This one was just a small building with a row of parking in front of it. But I didn't need more than that, so it fit me like a glove. As soon as I arrived, I noticed that it was quite dark and there didn't seem to be anyone else's. So I parked my car and started walking towards the building. It took my time and stopped to stretch my body a bit, as I had been driving for several hours and was starting to feel all my muscles numb bonds in the building. I looked around and saw that there was a hall with a janitor's closet and a men's restroom on one side and a women's restroom on the other. There were also a couple of vending machines and a rack with magazines. I looked at one of the vending machines for a moment looking for some energy drink, then turned around and noticed a car that had pulled into the rest stop and parked right next to mine. I found this a bit odd with all the other open spaces why park right next to my car. I tried not to make a big deal out of it and went into the restroom, did what I had to do, and came out in about 5 minutes. And as I did, I noticed that the car was still parked right next to mine and had the lights on, so it looked as if the driver was still inside. This made me wonder what the driver was doing, but overall it didn't seem like much. So I looked around and my attention went back to the vending machine. I decided to buy a Red Bull, and as I drank it, I couldn't help but turn my attention back to the car parked next to mine for some reason. There was something I didn't like when I looked back towards my car. I noticed that the car next to mine was still running. I started to walk to get out, but just a few meters from the door, I heard the engine of that car turn off, and a second later the driver's door opened, and a tall bearded man came out wearing a brown leather jacket with both hands in his pockets. I stopped where I was near the door, and the man started walking towards me. Suddenly I felt my body fill with tension, and there was something about this guy that definitely gave me a bad feeling. However, I kept calm and tried to look calm, but the truth is that I was quite nervous, especially because of the fact that his eyes were fixed on me and they really seemed malicious when I was only a few meters away. I moved from the door and started walking in the direction of my car, and at some point we inevitably passed each other. I greeted him with a nod and he did the same. But when I took a couple of steps forward, I heard when this man called me back with a hey. At that moment, I turned around only to find myself face to face with the barrel of a 9mm pistol pointed right at my face, and the man's macabre smile, "Why are you in such a hurry?" hesked me. I struggled to control my breathing, which was getting faster and faster. I raised my hands as that I was not resisting, and asked him what he wanted, to which he answered bluntly, "Give me your watch, your wallet, and your cell phone." I obeyed his request without a hint, thinking that that was all, and now he would let me go, but after giving him everything. He motioned with his head for me to accompany him, but instead of entering the store, he made me walk to the back where the forest was, and we entered the forest. At that moment, my heart was pounding because I was sure that if he only wanted to rob him, he would have let me go, but instead, he was leading me into this forest, which clearly showed that he had another intention. I was sure that for some reason he wanted to kill me. As I was walking towards the place, I asked him why he was leading me there, and he just said walk. I was really scared and begged him to please let me go. I told him to take my care if he wanted to, but he wouldn't say anything. When we had walked about 15 or 20 minutes to the forest, he asked me to stop and turn around. I did as she asked, and we were face to face. He was only about 2 m away from meth. Then he pointed his gun right at my face, and I knew it was the end of me. I was going to die there inside a forest in the middle of nowhere. The only thing I could think about waste the suffering of my parents. When the news reached them at that moment, I could feel the tears running down my face and every fiber of my body trembling while this wretch looked at me with eyes full of evil, asked me to kneel down. And I did, knowing that these were my last moments of life. I closed my eyes, tightly waiting for the shot, and then it happened. Bang, 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 3 shots in a row. I covered my ears with my hands and screamed with each burst falling on my face to the ground, crying, and in absolute panic, I'm dead. I thought, but I felt nothing, no pain of being hurt, just the most intense feeling of terror I have ever experienced in my life, a fear so deep, I could feel it in my bones. That's when I heard his laughter. The guy was geeing as if someone had told him the funniest joke in the world, and while I was still laying on the ground crying and terrified, he said, "Go home, kid, and don't forget to wash your pants." Then he turned around and walked away laughing. Like it was nothing, I started to utching myself looking for any wounds, and there were none. And then I knew it hadn't shot me. I don't think I can describe what I felt at that moment. It was a mixture of terror, joy at being alive and unharmed, and a deep sense of humiliation. It was a mix of emotions that I couldn't process. So I stayed right where I was for a few minutes, while I heard the engine of the guy's car start and then drive away. Only then did I gather the strength to stand up and walk back to my car. But first, I went back into the building and washed my face in the bathroom. Looking in the mirror, I could see that my condition was terrible. My face was red and swollen, and covered with a sticky mixture of tears and mucus. I was grateful to be alive, but I also felt deeply humiliated and dejected while my body was still shaking uncontrollably. I guess I was still in the midst of some kind of nervous shock. After a few minutes, I left the store and drove to the nearest town there. I was able to borrow a phone and called the police later. It told the officers what had happened to me and gave the detailed description of the guy that night. I rented a room in that town and spent the night there. The next day, feeling a little better, I continued on my way, but without stopping anywhere. I just drove straight to my friend's house once there. It told them what had happened to me, and they couldn't believe it, nor could they believe how close I came to dying that night. I stayed at my friend's house for a couple of weeks, as I do every year, and during that period, it tried to appear as normal as possible, but deep down I was very shocked, and that shock didn't go away for months and even a day. When I look back on that experience, I experienced again the same emotions that overwhelmed me that day. I never knew anything about the guy who robbed me and almost killed me, so I don't know if they managed to catch him or he's still out there terrorizing people. I just went on with my life. Butize and never stopped at a rest stop since then. Hello, my name is Danon, and I've been driving a truck for over 25 years for a living. The story I'm going to tell you today happened about 4 years ago, and it's something that marked my life forever. It was a rainy night, and I was driving my huge truck on the highway, which by that time was completely deserted. Since it was 4 in the morning, I was 4 hours away from arriving at the company's warehouse, where I had to deliver a shipment of industrial supplies, when a torrential rain that seemed to come out of nowhere began to. Of all this made visibility difficult on the road, but after so many years practicing this profession, I can say that I am quite used to driving in these conditions for long hours, although that did not prevent me from being annoyed at the thought that the rain would delay me the whole trip. However, the downpour was not the only thing that caused me discomfort that night, for some unknown reason. Since I entered that last stretch of road, a strange restlessness began to take over my body. I could not describe exactly what it was. I just know that something felt strange. Maybe it was the eerie silence that surrounded me, or the fact of having many hours driving without rest. What is certain is that I could not get rid of that feeling that something was not right. It tried to push it aside by putting some music on the radio, and it certainly helped to distract my mind a bit, but the strange restlessness never went away. I kept driving despite the poor visibility, but is loath to have maneuverability in case of any unforeseen events. It's a precaution I always take when driving in the rain. However, a few kilometers ahead, something very unexpected happened. The rain was still falling with intensity, while the fog was getting thicker. However, I could see through the fog the lights of a cart that seemed to be coming at full speed in the opposite direction, and was heading directly towards me. Due to the thick fog, it was impossible for me to see it, until it was practically on top of my truck. Immediately and reflexively turned the steering wheel to try to avoid it the last second, but in doing so, due to the moisture on the road, it became impossible for me to regain control of the truck, and no matter how hard I struggled to stabilize it, I ended up flipping violently and spinning off the road. The last thing I remember was the sensation of weightlessness as the truck spun and the thunderous noise of the pant of the overturn. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground, and everything was a blur. My head throbbed with pain, and my body felt the heavy. It tried to move but could not, and soon realized that I was severely injured and could not move my legs in shock, as it tried to remember what had just happened. Eventually, it all came back to me, the cramming mimetering to right the truck overturning, the noise, the banging, the pain, and now melting in the middle of nowhere injured. And alone, it tried to call for help, but my voice was very weak. I could barely make a sound. I was strapped in the Reuben. I didn't know how long I would survive as I lay there struggling to keep my eyes open. I mustered all the strength I had left to try to shout for help, but it was nous, because at that moment I began to hear footsteps approaching, and in the distance I managed to distinguish the sound of an engine running. A few moments later, an older man approached, met together with a younger one. They were a father and his son. They helped me and called an ambulance at times. I could feel my consciousness fading, but I held on as long as I could, knowing that help was on the way. Finally, the ambulance arrived, and I was rushed to the hospital. On the way, I was in and out of consciousness, but I remember the doctors telling me that I had several broken bones, internal bleeding, and a severe head injury. They also said I was lucky to be alive. I couldn't believe it. I had been in a near fatal accident, and I had no idea how I was going to recover from that, or if I really would, because judging from what the doctors were saying, it was possible that these were my last moments in this world. Fortunately, I did not die, but the recovery process was so torturous that at times it made me wish it had been days turned into weeks, and I was still in the hospital trying to heal from my injuries. I could not move and was completely dependent on the nurses and doctors. I had never felt so helpless in my life, but as the days went by, I began to notice a strange thing happening around me. There were times when I would wake up in the middle of the night and I could feel someone watching me. At first, I thought it was just me because of the brain damage or some injury done to my brain. But the more it happened, the more I began to believe that something was not right. One night, as I was lying in my hospital bed, I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was a tall, dark figure, but I couldn't make out his features. It tried to scream, but no sound came out of my mouth. Meanwhile, the figure began to approach me. I tried to move, but I couldn't. It was absolutely desperate and terrifying. The figure kept coming closer until I could feel its cold breath right on my face. I closed my eyes tightly and began to pray. I was so terrified that I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. It stayed like that for a few minutes until I finally opened my eyes, and then I realized he was gone. I couldn't sleep for the rest of the night, and when the nurses came in the morning, it told them what had happened, but they dismissed it by saying that it was a simple sleep paralysis episode, which could be a consequence of my brain injury and the stress of the whole situation. But I disagreed. I was convinced that what I had seen was completely real and not a hallucination, as they wanted to make it look like from that day. And I began to see the figure more frequently everywhere and at any time. Off the day, perhaps you might think that as the days went by, I got used to it. But I didn't. It was absolutely terrifying every time, and it was driving me crazy. However, I didn't say anything about it again. Instead, I started researching on the internet, as I was somehow sure that this figure had something to do with the accident. It was then that I discovered that on that particular stretch of road, there had been many accidents similar to the one I had, and many of the victims claimed to have experienced strange occurrences. Some talked about seeing the lights of a car ramming them, while others had claimed to have seen a figure in the middle of the road that caused them to have the accident that moment. I knew that I was not alone in my experience, and that indeed that figure that seemed to be stalking me day and night was the reason for my accident. I was afraid, but I was also angry. I wanted to know why this happened to me. I wanted to know who or what that figure was, and why it was chasing me. But first, I had to make sure that this was really the case. The man who stopped to help me that day with his son was William. He accompanied me to the hospital and told my family, and before after left me his phone numbers, saying that I could count on him if I ever needed him. I couldn't be more grateful, as she and his son were my guardian angels that night. And she was coming very close to me when it all happened, which means she must have also seen the car coming at full speed in the opposite direction. That afternoon, I called him and asked him about it. And his answer simply corroborated what I already suspected, and that is that he had not seen any other car. He told me that at the time of the accident, he was coming a few meters behind my truck when he suddenly noticed that the truck turned left abruptly and started zigzagging until it finally went off the road and started spinning. But he assured me that there was no car revving in the opposite direction, and that in fact another car passed by until the ambulance arrived. Although I already suspected that something like this is what had really happened to. Met the fact that William confirmed it truly sent chills down my spine. As this figure, that ghost or whatever it was, almost caused me to lose my life, as happened to several of the drivers who encountered the ghost car before me. But the strangest thing happened that same night later, at about 11 p.m. That same day, the figure appeared again at the foot of my bed, and once again began to approach until it positioned itself next to me. But this time it did not disappear, but began to whisper words to me. It began to tell me Its story, the figure began to tell me that he was a truck driver who had died in an accident on that stretch of road many years ago. He told me he was driving his truck in the middle of a night just as dark and rainy as that one when suddenly out of nowhere came a car coming the other way. But unlike me, he couldn't avoid it, so they collided head-on, and Noon survived. I froze in just as I was about to ask him who he was. A nurse opened the door and came over to give me my treatment for that night. That was the last time that figure appeared in front of me. Since then, I never saw her again. The next day I began a tour search about the accidents in that area, and after several hours of searching, I came across a news item from 35 years ago, where it was reported about a fatal crash on that highway in which the driver of a sedan car who was under the influence of alcohol drove the wrong way on the highway and collided head-on with a cargo truck, and both drivers lost their lives instantly. However, there were no details about the drivers involved in the accident. When I saw this news, I realized that that night, it was not really the spirit of the truck driver who caused my accident, as I thought, but the spirit of the driver of the other car. But what I found saddest of all is the fact that probably these two souls were trapped in that moment, unable to transcend, since then every chance I get is a prayer for both of them, that they may finally find their way to eternal rest. My name is Elolai, and all this happened in August 2008. I remember it as clear as if it were yesterday. It was off the hottest summers we had had in years, and I was behind the wheel of my old cargo truck, where I was hauling a load of steel sheets, which were to be used in a construction site in southern Missouri. By then I had over 20 years of truck driving, and I honestly thought I had seen it all. But what happened that day to this day haunts me. I drove down Highway 60 on some stretch of road through the Mark Twain National Forest, a really beautiful place during the day, but very desolate and scary at night. I was making good time record and planned to stop at a truck stop that is near Springfield to go to the restroom and get something to eat and maybe get some sleep before continuing on my route. However, a few miles before arriving at said stop, I came across an old beat-up truck parked on the side of the road with its hood up, and as I was approaching it, I see chubby guy start waving his arms at me. Wet truck drivers have an unspoken code, and that is that we always help each other. So slow down, parked a little further ahead, and approached him to see what was going on and try to help him. The man was about 45 years old, and he was wearing a baseball flannel. That was supposed to be white, but it was completely stained with grease, just like his face and hands. So it was evident that he had been working on that truck for quite some time. Maybe all day. By this time, the sun was going down, and before I got aware, I was just started walking towards me. "Thank God you stopped," he said, looking quite relieved. He hooked my hand and told me his name was Neil, and then explained that he had been stranded there for about 4 or 5 hours, and that apparently the car had a damaged alternator. So asked me if I could take it to the nearest town to spend the night there, and see if in the morning I could find the part and a mechanic I could bring with him. I looked him up and down, and after sizing him up for a few moments, he seemed like a harmless guy. Oh, I didn't have the heart to him stranded there. After all, the next town was 20 minutes on the road. Neil went back to his truck, grabbed a small duffel bag, and climbed into the passenger seat of mine, and then we were on our way. Neil was a pretty chatty guy. He commented to me that he was from Alabama and was on his way to pick up a load in St. Louis. He also told me that his old truck had been giving him trouble for weeks, but a thought that could make it farther when we were about 15 to 20 minutes down the road. I noticed a couple of cars in my rear view mirror. They were coming one behind the other and following us pretty close. At first, I didn't pay any attention to them. I thought maybe they were a couple of impatient drivers who wanted to overtake me, but both cars stayed behind us, which was quite strange considering that we were the only vehicles on the road at that time. Starting to get nervous, I asked Neil if he knew them, pointing my head towards the rear view mirror. Then he turned to look and told me he had never seen them before. I joked with him, asking if he was running from someone, and he laughed a little nervously, saying nothing of the sort, but I noticed his voice was shaking, which let me know he was a little nervous. I couldn't judge him though, as I was getting nervous too. That pair of cars following us from that moment on. I kept an eye on these cars. They followed us for about 10 miles, and not once did they try to pass. That was too suspicious. But when we got to a stretch where we had woods on both sides of the road, they finally made their move. Both cars accelerated, and after passing us, they turned and crossed the road, closing us off completely, which forced me to brake hard. "What the hell is that?" out loud. The cars stopped dead in front of yous, and 3 guys got out of them all, armed, and walked straight towards my truck. My heart started pounding, and as I looked to my side, I noticed that Neil was pale and sweating profusely. I whispered to him to try to stay calm and reached my seat. Only to realize that I had left my gun in the house before I left recently. The company I worked for had decided to crack down on drivers carrying guns, which is why on my last few trips I didn't carry it with me. The guys came up to my truck and positioned themselves at both doors, pointing guns. At Chusin, one of the guys ordered us to get out once again. I looked at Neil, who looked like he was going to pass out at any moment, and told the guys I didn't want any trouble raising my hands in surrender. It told them they could take whatever they wanted. But then the same guy repeated, "Toos to get off the truck," but this time in a more aggressive, all of course, wetted as we were told, we slowly got off the truck, and as we were doing so, Neil tripped and almost fell. Another one of the guys instructed us to move to the side of the road, keeping the gun pointed, asked and ordered us to empty our pockets, and we handed him our wallets, phones, and keys. "You can't take the truck if you want." I said, "Just let us go, shut up," has napped. He subsequently took our stuff and threw it into one of the cars, then walked back towards us, while the other two were still pointing at us, and then threw the keys to the truck back to me and gestured for me to get in and start it. I looked at Neil again, who looked as confused as I was. Then the guy told me for my own sake and my friends not to try anything. I went back to the cab with one of the guys pointing at me, turned the key, and the engine started roaring. Then the other guy motioned for Neil to get into one of the cars, the guy pointing at Neil, who appeared to be the ringleader, ordered that he be in one of the cars, and I was in the truck. I had no idea what his plan was, but I wasn't about to argue with the guns. So I started driving again, following the car where Neil was riding along with two of the guys, while the other guy came up behind. We drove for what seemed like hours, although it was probably only about 20 minutes at most. The guy took us down a fairly narrow dirt road that led off the highway and much deeper into the forest. My mind inevitably began to search for escape routes, but it was useless. I had no way out, and even if there, would not leave poor Neely mercy of those guys, as they would probably retaliate against. It was every complicated situation. The trees closed in around us, and I knew we were heading into a trap. Finally, the cars stopped in a small clearing in the woods, and the guys got out still holding their guns and motioned for me to get out of the truck. I got out of the cab with my hands shaking and my heart racing. If they had brought us this far, I was sure it wasn't for anything good. Well, I thought if they had wanted to just robust, they would have done it on the road and left with our belongings in the truck. No problem, the ringleader motioned for me to follow him into the woods, where Neil was already being lulled by another of the crooks. This one was a short, rather stocky, with a truly devilish look on his face, which he turned to me in a moment and gave every mob half smile. We walked for a few minutes until we came to an old abandoned cabin. My insides twisted with fear when I saw what the guys pushed us inside, and I noticed that there were only a couple of pieces of furniture and a lot of garbage. They ordered us to sit on the old dusty couch. "What do you want?" I asked the guy who seemed to be the boss, trying to keep my voice steady. Then the guy with the devilish look smiled again and in that creepy way, and told me, "Just make sure you don't go running to the police." Then he turned to his companions, who also started laughing, and then he started to tie our hands and feet. It felt a cold sweat run down my body when the third guy said in a mocking tone, "Don't go anywhere," and they all started laughing. But after that they left the cabin, closing the door. Immediately after they left, I began to struggle to loosen the ropes and told Neil that we had to get out of the rear. Hugh, who was pale and shaking uncontrollably, said to me in a cracked, almost whispered voice, "They're going to kill you, aren't they too?" Which I replied, "Note if we make it first," trying to sound confident without my voice giving away how scared I was too. I moved my wrists, trying to loosen the knots as fast as I could. It was slow and painful work, but I could feel the rope starting to give way. At that moment, we heard the car start up and drive away, leaving us alone, wrapped in the mysterious silence of the forest. Once I was able to get free of the ropes, I began taunting Neil Shansan feet. "Thanks, buddy," he said to me, his voice cracking and trying to lighten the moment. Zed saved them for later when we're really safe, and he nodded his head, and he stumbled out of the cabin and looked around. It was already dark, and visibility was very low, but we could tell that the cars were gone, and so was my truck. So Neil asked me if I knew how to get back, and the truth is that at that point we had walked so deep into the woods that I had every vague idea, but I knew we should walk in the opposite direction of the cabin, and then we would probably find the road. So we did, and finally reached the road, but we began to wonder if it was really a good idea, as we were panicking at the thought that the guys might come back. But if we wanted to get help, we couldn't stay in the woods. So I started walking, keeping to the edge of the road, ready to dive into the trees at the first sign of threat. The sun had set a while ago, projecting, so the only thing we could see was the reflection of the moon on the leaves of the trees. I kept my ears wide open, trying to listen for any car sounds that might be approaching. After what seemed like an eternity, we heard the faint sound of Avical approaching. I couldn't help but shiver, thinking it might be our attackers. I hit at Neil, dragging him into the brush, and we crouched down, holding our breath as the cars slowly approached. Then we Realized it was from earlier, but was an old beat-up sedan, and the driver looked like a fairly old man, probably someone from around there. Making sure it wasn't those guys, I immediately stood up, waving my arms. Hey Wes started yelling at the driver, and we saw the car start to slow down. Until it stopped, the driver rolled down his window and looked at us suspiciously. What's going on here? He's with some suspicion. Please, we need your help. Eden briefly told him that our car was stolen, and we were kidnapped. I also asked him to please call the police. Asked the thieves had taken our phones and all our belongings. The man looked at us for a few seconds, then nodded. Get in. I'll take you to the sheriff's office. We climbed into the back seat, exhausted and relieved. The man introduced himself as Jeff and drove us to the nearest town, a little place called Ellington, and dropped us off at the sheriff's office. On their way, gave our statements describing the three men. And all that had happened. The sheriff, a grizzled veteran named Stewart, fortunately took our story very seriously. We'll send a patrol to look for your truck, and we'll get those men, told us with great assurance. You two are lucky to be alive. He was certainly right about that. Neil and I exchanged a look. We were alive, but shocked to the core. The sheriff's deputies led us back to the clearing in the woods, but there was no sign of the men. But as we walked the perimeter, an officer called on the radio, announcing that they had found my abandoned truck. We headed toward that spot with the sheriff, and sure enough, there was my truck abandoned in the trees, but otherwise intact. Keep your eyes peeled. The sheriff do says we prepared to leave, as these guys might come back. We thanked him and got back on the road, heading for the nearest truck stop when he needed to call our companies and report what had happened. But more than anything, we needed to get some rest. As we drove away, I couldn't but think about how close we had come to dying out there. I had always considered myself a tough guy, but this experience had shaken me to my core. Neil was silently staring out the window, lost in his own thoughts. We parted ways at the truck stop, exchanging phone numbers and promises to stay in touch, but we never saw each other again. Although I remember him every time I passed through southern Missouri, that night changed me quite a bit. I'm now much more cautious, much more aware of the dangers on the road. I still help people when I can, but I'm always on guard, always ready for the unexpected. And every once in a while, when I drive down the darkest, loneliest stretches of highway, I remember those men and wonder if they ever got caught, or if they're still out there looking for their next victim. But I don't let that consume my life. Goes on, and so do I. After all, the road has always been my best place, and all the time there is another load to haul to another destination. And as long as my mission remains to be behind the wheel, I will keep moving forward, no matter what the road has in store for me. Truck driver is always on the move and always on the lookout for the next stroke. My name is Ernesto, and the story I'm going to tell you now happened to me one night when I happened to go through, or rather encounter, the scariest situation I have ever been in my life. I used to work at night in Arizona, almost in the middle of nowhere, on an old ranch that had now been converted into a hotel. It was a good place to work, so much so that I would venture to say it was probably the easiest job I have ever had. But the only downside was having to drive an hour and a half from night to my house. It was truly exhausting. I hated it at first, as it took a big chunk of my free time, but over time I just got used to it. One night when I was making my usual commute home, I stopped at this taco truck that was about halfway there to grab it to eat, as I was completely starving and couldn't wait to get home. The truck was located outside of an RV parks, so I'm guessing the owner either lived there or drove there every night to sell. The truck had been working at that location for about 2 months, as I had seen it several times before, but I had never stopped. Mainly because I was always in too much of a hurry, as I had to drive over 100 miles. But then that first night I stopped there because I really had to eat something. I was so hungry that my guts were rumbling loudly, so when I saw the sign in the distance, I pulled off the road to where the entrance ramps to the trailer park was, then got out of my car and walked towards the truck. To my surprise, it turned out this guy was preparing some of the best tacos I had ever eaten in my life. I ordered them to go and ate them in my car. I was truly in awe of these delicious tacos, or maybe it was hunger, but they tasted like glory. I drove home that night feeling like I made a great culinary find. So the next night, I did the exact same thing, and so did the next, and I kept stopping the time. I can't say daily, but I can for sure it became a regular upon my way home from work. I wouldn't go back to my car to eat them in desperation like the first time either. Now I would stand next to this guy's truck and enjoy my tacos with quite a bit of gusto, and take advantage of the variety of salsas the guy offered, and then close with a soda and a cigarette. He also had those nice lemon-scented hand wipes, which he always gave me, and I always saved some for the ride home. The truth is, I must have done this maybe 40 or 50 times over the next few months. But despite stopping by almost every night and striking up conversation with him quite often, I curiously never knew the guy's name. I didn't even ask the first time, and then I just didn't ask him at all. Well, I really didn't need to know his name, and he didn't need to know mine. So I just glossed over it. I guess that makes me sound a little rude now that I think about it, but I mean, he didn't ask my name either, so I guess it didn't bother him. I was just one of the many regular customers she had in his business. The point is, I wish I had asked him his name because the day came when that information would be important. Perhaps life or death, and I just didn't have it, so I got mad at myself for not asking when I parked my car in the usual spot, as I did every time I went, and as usual I walked to the truck. Everything seemed perfectly normal at first, but it was not. This was the first time I came to this place, and the taco guy was in the truck preparing his merchandise, and there didn't seem to be any customers thither. Apparently only I was there at that moment. Even better, it thought I waited a few moments, but he didn't come out. It thought maybe he was checking his back wheels out of sight, or maybe he had opened late and was still organizing things, but after waiting for several minutes, it figured all I had to was whistle or yell, and the guy would come running out of wherever he was stuck to serve. So I walked over to the truck and started calling, but Noon showed up, and Noon was answering. I also noticed that it was very quiet. There was Noon on the road, nor did anyone seem to be awake in the trailer park. Everything was completely quiet, and as I looked around impatiently waiting for the taco guy to show up, I started to smell a burning smell. I stood on my tiptoes and couldn't see if there was really something on the grill or not, but I thought there was, because I could definitely smell something burning there, and as I looked, I started to see some smoke coming out, as well as something was definitely burning on his grill. And I couldn't see what it was, but there was something there scorching. I yelled again, saying something stupid like, "Hey, I think you're burning something here, buddy." But still everything was silent, except for the sound of that something's izzling on the grill. Above me, it's not that I'm small, it's just that this was one of those big taco trucks, not a small one like an ice cream truck. Know this truck, people, and it was very well equipped. That's why I couldn't see what was on it. Grill, at that point, I was already starting to get frustrated, but also worried because there was something burning in his kitchen, and the guy was not showing up. And if that something kept burning, it could be potentially dangerous, because not only could it ruin his grill, but the truck could end up catching fire. And that is not an exaggerational, it takes. I saw a spark and buff goodbye to me favorite taco truck. But most of all, this guy would lose his source of livelihood. The thing is, I actually like the guy. I like tacos. I like the way he nodded sympathetically when I complained about something that happened during. Most of all, I like the fact that he was always there every day working hard and consistently. And if there's one thing I've learned, that it's hard to find reliable things, so when you find them, you learn to appreciate them even when they come in the form of a late-night taco trucks. So I thought if that were me, I'd want at least someone to turn off the gas or turn off the grill and keep my workplace and probably my most valuable asset from going up in ashes. I had no idea where this guy was or if maybe he had some kind of medical emergency. The only thing I knew for sure was that I didn't want to see my favorite taco truck in the world goop in flames. So I walked around the side to where the entrance was. There was just a narrow door with a set of retractable stairs. I walked up there, grabbed the door handle, opened it, and the first thing I see is an empty open cash register with an overturned drawer on the cover and a bunch of loose changes scattered around it. The first thing that came to my mind was a robbery, but I also didn't see any signs of a violent struggle or anything like that. I know the cash drawer had been pulled out, but a robber could have pulled a gun on my Tiro, told him to run and not look back, and then emptied the register himself before leaving. Just thinking about that possibility really pissed me off. It meant this was a hardworking guy who took great pains to do things right, and had probably obtained this truck with a lot of sacrifice and many hours of hard work. Then a crook comes along and steals the fruits of all his labor to surely earn it in drugs, however seeing the scenes a clean. I was thankful that at least Noon had been hurt, but that was until I walked over to the grill to turn it off to dust, so I had to go a couple more steps forward and up a couple of metal steps. Then the grill was to my left, but when I looked toward it to see it burning, my heart nearly stopped from shock. Then panic, what was burning on that grill was a perfect jet black outline of a completely scorched person's hand. When I saw that, my shock was so great that I fell backwards down the small stair. But fortunately, I was able to keep my balance and stay on my feet. After that, all I could do was try not to look at it again as I opened the small cab CET under the grill and put out the flame. Then simply walked back to the truck door, and after closing it, walked back to my cart to call the police. At first, I didn't really know what to tell the operator. I mean, I knew there had been a robbery, and I knew someone had been seriously injured, but I didn't know where he had gone or where he had been taken after he was robbed. And worse, I didn't even know his name. That was a complete mystery. I mean, the only reason I could be sure it wasn't simply some kind of accident was because of all the missing money. So I answered a bunch of questions from the operator, and he told me that a couple of agents would be coming to take care of the matter after making this report. It truly wasn't necessary for me to stay on the scene, but I wanted to make sure the taco guy wouldn't come back at 10 time with a bandage around his arm or anything like that, but noon showed up. I waited maybe 30-40 more minutes there, but noon showed up. Note vent the police has spent almost an hour at the scene and noon showed up, so I decided to goon my way and drive home. I drove back home, feeling a little numb. My head had been spinning the whole time, wondering what had happened and why the cops didn't show up with their lights and sirens when they knew something so terrible had happened. I still beat myself up for never knowing the TO's name, because if I had known it, maybe I could have looked it up or been of more help to the cops. I tried Googling things like taco truck owner burned by robber and things that might be related, but they turned up a bunch of violent robberies and none matched the description of the scene I came across in the days that followed. I never saw the taco truck again. They moved it from the and I never heard from the taco guy again. I just hope he's okay. This all happened 6 years ago. It was sometime in June 2018. Back then I decided to goon an impromptu solo trip for a day. I really enjoy sightseeing, and there were a couple of places somewhat nearby that I still wanted to cross off my list of places to visit before I had to go back to college in August. The plan was simple: get up early to start the road trip, then see a few different sites during the day, and finally start the drive home around 9:00 p.m. or so. I figured this way I could maximize my time without having to pay for a hotel, and thus save myself some money. The trip there was fine, but with the return trip, it was a very different story. I ended up leaving around 10 p.m. According to Apple Maps, I estimated it would take about 4.5 hours to get home. I had made about half of the drive when I was starting to get tired. I tried to stay awake by washing my face with water from my canteen several times, but it was no use, and at one point it was getting dangerous to drive. I told myself that at the next dread stop, I would pull over and take an hour nap before continuing on my way. I could still make it home at a pretty decent hour, so I did exactly what I set out to do a few miles down the road. I found our stop and pulled into the parking lot. The first thing I noticed was the lack of cars. The place was completely empty, and if it hadn't been for some lights on, I would have thought it was abandoned, but I guess this made sense. I mean it because it was pretty late, and this wasn't a busy road. I leaned back in my seat and set an alarm to go an hour. When it went off, I realized I would have to go inside the building, because now I had to use the bathroom, my bladder always complicating things for me. I started walking towards the building, and when I entered, I found the restrooms and opened one of the cubicles. I wasn't even there for about 30 seconds, when suddenly I could hear someone talking outside the restrooms in the hallway. This surprised me because I didn't even hear the front door open, and my car was the only one in the parking lot just a minute ago. I didn't see how someone could have been here, so that's when the restroom door opened, and by that time I was a little nervous, but I realized it was most likely just another normal person that I somehow didn't notice was there. So I didn't give it much thought. I was ready to leave when light knocking on the cubicle door got my attention. I awkwardly responded with "There's someone there," but there was no response. It was dead silence. Now I was a little more nervous, so I decided to stand in the cubicle until he left. That's when I noticed an eye peering through the crack in the cubicle door. And when we made eye contact, the guy started screaming and relentlessly banging his head against the door. What the hell is that? Under my breath, starting to feel scared, thinking fast. I used my whole body to block the door to keep him from breaking it, but seeing that wouldn't stop banging and screaming, it threw the door open and knocked the guy down, then proceeded to run as fast as I could out of the bathroom and out of my car. I was halfway to the parking lot when I heard the front door open behind me. I turned to look, and sure enough, this guy was chasing me. However, I was much faster and finally got in my car, started it up, and started backing out. But the guy caught up to me and managed to slam his body into my door as she accelerated. I looked in my rear view mirror, and as I drove away, I saw the guy get up like it was nothing and just stood there, looking in my direction. I was beyond shocked. I couldn't process what had just happened, honestly. I didn't know what to think. You always hear crazy stories like this, but you never think it will actually happen to you. When I left the rest stop, I was so freaked out that I was probably over the speed limit for a few miles, and the rest of the way home. I guess it goes without saying that I wouldn't fall asleep by any means, as my body was pumped with adrenaline after my close encounter of the third kind, with this being from hell. I still have no idea who he was, where he was from, or what his damn problem was. If I had to guess, I'd say he was probably a homeless guy who just wasn't right in the head. But then again, why would a homeless person be practically in the middle of nowhere on the side of the freeway? It doesn't make sense. How do I get there? I noticed that I've never stopped at to rest stops.